Imagine walking into a place where nothing about you matters. Not your past. Not your reputation. Not even your name, just the way you carry yourself. The air feels different there. Heavier, like every movement is being watched, not with curiosity but with quiet judgment. Now imagine standing still in that space, not reacting. Not proving anything, just being present. Short pause. Across the room someone shifts. Not loudly. Not aggressively. But intentionally. The kind of presence that doesn't ask for attention. It takes it. A figure that reminds you of Chuck Norris. Calm, grounded, completely aware of everything around him. No words exchanged. But something unspoken begins. A question. Not out loud, but felt. Who controls this moment? Most people in that situation would react instantly. A step back. A defensive posture. A need to respond. Because pressure demands reaction. That's what we're used to. But what if someone didn't react at all? What if they simply observed, breathing steady, posture relaxed, eyes focused, but not aggressive. A presence like Keanu Reeves, quiet, composed, completely unmoved by the need to prove anything. And suddenly, the energy changes. Not dramatically, not in a way that everyone would notice, but enough. Enough to make the moment pause. Because now the situation isn't about dominance anymore. It's about control. Internal control. The kind most people never develop. So the real question isn't who's stronger or who would win. It's something far more interesting. What happens when one person tries to test the moment and the other refuses to be pulled into it? Because sometimes the most powerful move is the one no one sees. This isn't a story about violence. It never was. What you're seeing unfold here is something far more subtle. Pressure. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but is immediately understood. In certain environments, people don't need to raise their voice to shift the atmosphere. It happens through presence, through timing, through the way someone chooses to enter a space, and how others respond to it. Because in reality, most confrontations don't begin physically. They begin psychologically. A look held a second too long. A step taken slightly closer than expected. A silence that feels intentional. These are the moments where people get tested. Not always with aggression, but with expectation. The expectation that you'll react. And reaction is easy. It's instinct. It's what most people fall into without even realizing it. But composure, that's different. That's trained. That's chosen. Now, when people think of someone like Keanu Reeves, they often associate him with roles that demand intensity and control, especially in films like John Wick. Long hours of preparation, repetition, focus on movement and awareness. But it's important to understand something clearly, that training is for performance, for storytelling, for bringing realism to the screen, not for real-world confrontation. And yet, discipline, even when learned for a role, can shape how someone carries themselves, how they breathe under pressure, how they respond when others expect a reaction. On the other side of the room, a presence like Chuck Norris represents something different. Not loud, not exaggerated, but deeply rooted in awareness. The kind of presence that doesn't rush, doesn't force, just observes. And that's where the tension builds. Not because something is happening, but because something could happen, and everyone can feel it. This is how psychological pressure works. It creates a moment where two people share the same space, but approach it differently. Point one might be testing boundaries. Not aggressively. Not obviously, just enough to see what comes back. The other, simply present. Not stepping forward. Not stepping back, just holding position. And that's uncomfortable, because when there's no reaction, there's no feedback. No signal. No confirmation. And without that, the entire dynamic changes. In most situations, people rely on patterns. Action-reaction. Cause-effect. But when that pattern breaks, even slightly, it creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is where control begins to shift. So this moment isn't about who is stronger. It's about who understands the situation more clearly, who recognizes that not every challenge needs to be answered, and that sometimes, the strongest response is simply maintaining control over yourself. Because when pressure meets composure, something unexpected happens. The moment stops being about confrontation, and starts becoming about awareness. The room didn't change, but the feeling inside it did. Nothing dramatic happened. No sudden movement. No raised voices. And yet, something had clearly shifted, because now, everyone could sense it. That quiet tension that forms when two presences become aware of each other. Not as opponents, but as variables. A figure, steady, deliberate, takes a step forward. Not fast, not slow, just intentional. The kind of movement that isn't meant to threaten, but isn't accidental either. A presence reminiscent of Chuck Norris. grounded, balanced, completely in control of distance. Every step measured, every pause meaningful. This is how pressure builds without a single word being spoken. Because it's not about action. It's about possibility. What could happen? And sometimes, that's more powerful than anything that actually does. Across from him, nothing changes. No shift in stance. No defensive reaction. Just stillness. A calm, steady presence. Like Keanu Reeves. Eyes aware but not locked in challenge. Posture relaxed but not careless. Breathing slow, controlled, deliberate. And that's where the tension deepens. Because most people in this moment would do something, anything, adjust their footing, break eye contact, signal readiness. But here, there's none of that, and that absence becomes noticeable. Because when one person applies pressure, even subtly, they expect a response. A shift. A reaction. Something that confirms the moment is unfolding as expected. But when that response doesn't come, the dynamic changes. Another step forward. Closer now, still controlled, still calm, but undeniably intentional, testing space. Testing awareness. Not to provoke, but to understand. And still, nothing. No retreat. No escalation, just presence. Unmoved, unrushed, uninterested in proving anything, and that's when something unexpected happens. The tension doesn't break. It stretches. Like a line pulled tighter and tighter, not snapping but holding. Because now this isn't about movement anymore. It's about patience. Who acts first? Who changes first? Who feels the need to resolve the moment? These questions begin to form, not just between them but in the minds of everyone watching. Even in silence, the moment is loud. This is where psychology takes over. Because pressure, when not answered, doesn't disappear. It redirects. It turns inward. The one applying it becomes aware of the lack of response. And that awareness creates its own kind of tension. A slight pause, barely noticeable. But enough. Enough to signal that something is no longer following the expected pattern. And in that pause, control begins to shift. Not through force, not through dominance, but through understanding. Because the person who remains calm, in a moment designed to provoke reaction, is no longer part of the test. They've stepped outside of it. And when that happens, the entire situation changes. Now the question isn't, what will happen next? It's something far more subtle. Who truly controls the moment, when nothing is happening at all? And then, something changes. Not in a way that's obvious. Not in a way that draws attention. But in a way that matters. Because up until now, the moment has been balanced on expectation. Point one, presence applying quiet pressure. The other, not responding to it. And when that pattern holds for long enough, something begins to shift internally. Not outside. Inside. A subtle adjustment. Barely visible. A slight repositioning of weight. A change in angle. So small most people wouldn't even notice it. But it's there. Intentional. Precise. A response. Without being a reaction. This is where awareness becomes visible. Not through action, but through control. Because control isn't about doing more. It's about doing exactly what's needed, and nothing extra. A presence like Keanu Reeves doesn't suddenly become defensive. There's no guarded stance. No visible tension. Just alignment. Body, breath, and attention, working together. Calmly, quietly. Across from him, a figure reminiscent of Chuck Norris notices. Not reacts, but notices, and that distinction matters. Because when awareness meets awareness, the dynamic changes again. Now it's no longer about testing. It's about understanding. The space between them remains the same. But it feels different. More defined. More intentional. Like an invisible line has been drawn, not to divide but to establish. Clarity. This FAR.no further. And yet, no words have been spoken. This is the moment most people miss. Because nothing dramatic happens. No sudden escalation. No visible outcome. But internally, everything has shifted. Because the need to prove something has quietly disappeared. And when that need disappears, so does the tension. Not all at once. Not instantly, but gradually, like pressure releasing from something that was never meant to explode. The figure who stepped forward pauses. Not because he has to, but because there's nothing left to test. No reaction to analyze. No weakness to identify. Just stillness and clarity. This is where real control reveals itself. Not in dominance. Not in forcing an outcome. But in recognizing when an outcome isn't necessary because the moment has already resolved itself. Internally. A breath. Slow. Measured. Uninterrupted. And with it, the atmosphere begins to settle. Not because something ended, but because something was understood. The distance remains. unchanged. But now it carries a different meaning. Not uncertainty, not tension, but mutual recognition. The kind that doesn't need acknowledgement, because it's already felt. This is the shift. The part no one claps for. The part no one replays. Because from the outside, looks like nothing happened. But that's exactly the point, because the strongest moments are often the quietest ones. The ones where control is maintained, not asserted. Where awareness replaces impulse, and where discipline shows itself. Without needing to be seen. A presence like Chuck Norris doesn't step back in defeat. And a presence like Keanu Reeves doesn't step forward in victory. Because this was never about winning. It was about understanding. Understanding the moment. Understanding the space. And most importantly, understanding yourself. Because when you reach that level of control, you don't need to escalate. You don't need to respond. And you definitely don't need to prove anything. You simply remain. And in that stillness, everything changes. But here's what most people completely misunderstand. If this exact moment were captured on camera, clipped, edited, and uploaded, the reaction online would be immediate. Not thoughtful. Not reflective. But automatic. People would lean forward, watching closely, waiting for something to happen. And when it doesn't, they'd start asking the same question. Who won? It's predictable. Because that's how most content is consumed now. Fast, simplified, reduced to outcomes. Win or lose. Strong or weak. Dominant or defeated. But moments like this don't fit into those categories, and that's where the misunderstanding begins. Because nothing here was designed to produce a winner. There was no scoreboard, no final move, no clear resolution that could be replayed. In slow motion, just two individuals sharing a moment of awareness. Yet online, that wouldn't be enough. Clips would be cut. Titles would be exaggerated. Something like, Chuck Norris confronts Keanu Reeves, shocking result. And suddenly, the meaning changes. Not because the moment changed, but because the interpretation did. This is what happens. When quiet discipline meets loud expectations, people project outcomes onto situations that were never about outcomes. They look for dominance, where there was only presence. They search for conflict, where there was only control, and in doing that, they miss the entire point. Because the real story here isn't about what happened externally. It's about what didn't happen. No escalation. No reaction. No need to prove anything. That kind of restraint doesn't go viral easily. It doesn't trigger instant excitement. It doesn't create dramatic thumbnails. But it carries something far more valuable. Understanding. And yet, online culture often overlooks that. Because it's conditioned to reward intensity. The louder moment. The faster reaction. The clearer winner. But real discipline? It's quiet. Sometimes so quiet that people mistake it for weakness. Think about it. If someone doesn't react under pressure, what do most people assume? That they couldn't. That they hesitated. That they lost. But what if the opposite is true? What if choosing not to react is actually the highest level of control? This is where perception becomes misleading. Because we've been trained to associate strength with action, movement, force, response. But in reality, strength often looks like stillness, like patience, like awareness. That a presence like Keanu Reeves in this fictional moment isn't defined by what he does. It's defined by what he chooses not to do. And that distinction is easy to miss when everything is viewed through the lens of competition. On the other side, a presence like Chuck Norris is often associated with dominance in popular culture, strength, confidence, control. But even that perception can be misunderstood, because true awareness doesn't always push forward. Sometimes, it recognizes when forward isn't necessary, and that's the part no viral clip can fully capture. The moment of recognition, the silent agreement, the unspoken understanding that nothing needs to happen next. Online, that moment would be skipped, cut out, replaced with speculation. Debates would begin. Comments would flood in. Who's stronger? Who would win in a real fight? That was nothing. But those reactions say more about the audience than the moment itself, because they reveal an expectation that every situation must lead to conflict, that every interaction must produce a result, that every story must end with a clear outcome. And real life doesn't always work that way. Some of the most important moments don't end with action. They end with understanding. This is one of those moments. The kind that doesn't explode, but settles. The kind that doesn't prove anything, but reveals something. Something about discipline. Something about control. Something about the ability to stand in a moment of pressure and not be moved by it. So when people ask, who won? They're asking the wrong question, because nothing here was meant to be won. The real question is, who understood the moment? Who recognized that control isn't about dominating someone else. It's about mastering yourself, and maybe that's why moments like this are so often misunderstood, because they challenge the way we've been taught to see strength, not as something loud, not as something aggressive, but as something quiet, steady, and completely in control. And in a world that constantly demands reaction, that kind of control can be hard to recognize, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now, step away from the scene for a moment, because what just unfolded was never really about Keanu Reeves or Chuck Norris. It was about something deeper, something quieter, something most people overlook. Control. Not control over others, but control over yourself. Think about that. How often in life are you placed in moments where something inside you says, react, defend yourself, prove something, say something back? It happens fast, almost automatically. Someone raises their voice, someone questions you, someone steps into your space, and suddenly, you feel that pressure, that internal push, to respond. And most of the time, we do, without thinking, without pausing, because reaction feels natural, feels justified, feels necessary. Short pause. But what if it isn't? What if the strongest response is no response at all? That's uncomfortable, because silence can feel like weakness, stillness can feel like hesitation, and restraint can feel like losing. But in reality, it's the opposite. Because when you don't react immediately, you create space. Space to think, space to observe, space to understand what's actually happening. And in that space, you gain control. This is what discipline looks like. Not perfect behavior, not emotionless stillness, but the ability to choose your response instead of being controlled by it. A moment like this quiet, controlled interaction, reflects something most people spend years trying to learn: how to remain steady when everything around you is trying to pull you out of that state. Because pressure doesn't always come in obvious forms. Sometimes it's subtle. A look, a tone, a situation that feels slightly off. And in those moments, your instinct is tested. Do you react? Or do you remain aware? Do you let the moment control you? Or do you stay in control of yourself? This is where real strength lives. Not in overpowering someone, not in proving dominance, but in maintaining clarity when things become uncertain. And clarity comes from stillness, from slowing down, just enough to recognize what's actually happening. Because not every challenge is meant to be answered. Not every situation requires your energy, and not every moment deserves a reaction. That's a hard truth, especially in a world that constantly pushes you to respond faster, louder, stronger. But real discipline moves differently. It doesn't rush. It doesn't force. It observes. It waits. And when it acts, it does so with intention. Think about your own life. Be honest. When was the last time you felt pressure like that? A moment where you were expected to react, to say something, to prove something, and instead, you paused. You stayed calm. You chose not to escalate. Those moments might seem small, insignificant even, but they're not. They're everything, because they define how much control you actually have over yourself. Anyone can react. That's easy. That's instinct. But staying composed? That takes awareness. That takes effort. That takes discipline. And the more you practice that, the stronger it becomes. Not externally, but internally. You start to notice things differently. You stop taking things personally. You stop feeling the need to prove yourself in every situation. And most importantly, you stop giving your energy to moments that don't deserve it. That's power. Quiet power. The kind that doesn't need recognition. The kind that doesn't seek validation. The kind that simply exists because it's been built over time. So the next time you find yourself in a moment of pressure, remember this. You don't have to react immediately. You don't have to prove anything. And you definitely don't have to escalate. You can pause. You can breathe. You can choose. Because at the end of the day, the real measure of strength isn't how you act. When things are easy, it's how you respond. When they're not, and sometimes, the most powerful response is the one no one ever sees. And now, we arrive at the part most people never talk about. Because everything you've just experienced, the silence, the tension, the restraint, was leading here. Not to a conclusion, but to a realization. Short pause. Maybe. Strength isn't what we've been told it is. From a young age, we're taught to associate strength with action, with proving something, with standing your ground, loudly, confidently, visibly. But what if that's only one version of it? What if there's another kind of strength? One that doesn't need to be seen? A quieter kind, a deeper kind, the kind you saw reflected in that fictional moment between Keanu Reeves and a presence like Chuck Norris. Because nothing dramatic happened. No final move. No decisive outcome. No moment where one clearly stood above the other. And yet, it felt complete. Why? Because something more important than winning took place. Understanding. Understanding that not every situation is a battle. Understanding that not every challenge is meant to be answered. And most importantly, understanding that you don't have to prove your strength to possess it. This is the part that changes everything. Because once you truly understand this, your perspective shifts. You stop seeing the world as a constant series of confrontations. You stop measuring yourself against others. You stop asking, did I win? And start asking something far more meaningful. Did I stay in control? And that question has a very different impact. Short pause. Because control, real control, isn't about dominating someone else. It's about mastering your own response, your own emotions, your own impulses. 1 second pause. That's not easy. In fact, it's one of the hardest things a person can do. To stand in a moment of pressure and not react. To feel challenged and not respond with ego. To be tested and not feel the need to prove anything. That takes something most people never fully develop. Awareness. And awareness changes everything. Because once you become aware of your own reactions, you gain the ability to choose them instead of being controlled by them. That's where freedom begins. Not external freedom. Internal. The freedom to remain calm when others expect chaos. The freedom to stay grounded when others try to shift you. The freedom to walk away. Not because you have to, but because you choose to. And that choice, that's power. Real power. Short pause. The kind that doesn't fade. The kind that doesn't depend on validation. The kind that doesn't need an audience. Because here's the truth. The strongest person in the room isn't always the loudest, isn't always the most aggressive, isn't always the one who takes control of the situation. Sometimes, it's the one who doesn't need to, the one who understands that not every moment requires action, that not every challenge deserves a response, that not every situation is worth their energy. That level of understanding doesn't come quickly. It's built over time, through experience, through reflection, through moments where you realize reacting didn't help, proving something didn't matter, winning didn't actually change anything. And slowly, you begin to see things differently. You begin to value calm over chaos, clarity over impulse, control over reaction. And when you reach that point, something shifts inside you, the same way it did in that quiet moment we explored. Because now, you're no longer part of the tension. You're above it, observing it, understanding it, choosing how you engage with it. That's where real strength lives. Not in what you do, but in what you choose not to do. And that idea is powerful because it applies to every part of life. Not just moments like this, but conversations, conflicts, decisions, everyday situations where you're given a choice, react, or remain in control. So the next time you feel that pressure, that pull to respond, remember this moment, not as a confrontation, but as a reminder that you always have a choice to pause, to breathe, to observe, to understand, and then to decide. Because at the end of the day, strength isn't about what you prove, it's about what you control. And the people who truly understand that don't need to show it. They live it, quietly, consistently, without needing recognition. Maybe the strongest person in the room isn't the one who wins, it's the one who never needed to. If this perspective changed how you see strength, then you already understand the lesson.